I don't know how you got that card, but this room isn't for people like you.
My name is on it.
Names can be printed on anything. That doesn't make you welcome here.
Read the full card before you decide that.
Now security will know exactly who to remove.
300 people watched Dana Renshaw decide in under 60 seconds that a man in a worn jacket did not belong in her room. She announced it loudly. Then she made it permanent with a glass of red wine poured down his chest. The invitation still on the table carried a name she had never bothered to look up. The man it belonged to said nothing in return. He reached into his breast pocket, checked something only he could see, then walked out of the room without raising his voice once. What exactly had she just set in motion? If you've ever watched someone be dismissed before they even had a chance to speak, stay with this story. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is a good time. There's a lot more where this came from. The evening Dana Renshaw had spent months engineering looked exactly the way she intended. Broadstone Pavilion sat at the center of Denver's financial district, like a lantern made of glass and steel. Its interior lit with the kind of warm, deliberate light that made everyone inside look slightly more important than they were. More than 300 guests filled the space, bankers in tailored suits, local officials with practiced handshakes, contractors who had been waiting 18 months for this night, and journalists who had already written half their stories in advance. The occasion was the official announcement of the Horizon Loop Grid project, a $2 billion energy infrastructure initiative that would modernize the state's power grid and create thousands of jobs across the region. Dana had made certain the public understood who was responsible for bringing it to life. Her face had appeared on the covers of 3 business publications in the past 6 months. Her name was synonymous with the project. She had made it that way on purpose. What the cameras had not captured, what the press releases had carefully omitted, was that Renshaw Infrastructure Group was the developer, not the owner. The actual controlling stake. 52% of the project company belonged to a firm called Carrick Grid and Metals. That company owned the land rights, supplied the transformer systems, and had guaranteed the majority of the financing. Without Carrick Grid and Metals, there was no Horizon Loop. Without the signature of its founder, there was no closing. Dana knew the name of that founder, the way someone knows the name of a clause buried in a contract, present acknowledged and never examined too closely. Wesley Carrick had built his company quietly, which was the way he preferred to operate. He had no public social media presence, gave almost no interviews, and had spent years routing his negotiations through his chief of staff and legal team so that his own face remained largely unknown in industry circles. The one published photo that existed came from a small trade feature 7 years earlier, taken at a distance during a ribbon-cutting ceremony in Wyoming. He had not sought out attention then, and he had not sought it since. He was 42 years old, had founded Carrick Grid and Metals from a single equipment lease agreement, and had grown it into one of the most quietly influential infrastructure firms in the western United States. None of that was visible when he walked through the doors of Broadstone Pavilion that night. He arrived wearing the same gray suit he had put on that morning before driving his daughter to school. Willow Park Elementary had hosted its annual science exhibition, and Paige, 9 years old, and completely convinced she would one day design a city powered entirely by sunlight, had asked her father to stay until the judges announced their results. Wesley had stayed. He always stayed. There had been years when work had asked more of him than a single father could reasonably give, and he had made choices then that he still thought about. Those years were behind him. He had made sure of that. He arrived at Broadstone with a canvas tote bag over one shoulder. Paige's solar house model was still inside, along with the second-place ribbon she had accepted with the quiet dignity of someone who intended to win next year, and a small, folded piece of paper tucked into his inside breast pocket. Paige had pressed it into his hand as he was leaving. She had drawn the two of them standing in front of a city full of light, and written along the bottom in her careful, uneven print, "Build somewhere every family is safe." He had driven straight from the school parking lot. He had not had time to change. The registration desk near the pavilion entrance had 3 staff members working it when Wesley approached. His name was not appearing in their standard guest database because the invitation for the principal owner had been filed separately in a restricted folder accessible only to the event's senior coordinator, who was currently inside the main hall and had not been called. One of the staff members was reaching for the phone to request a manager when Dana crossed the lobby with a small group of journalists in tow and noticed the situation. She registered the gray suit, the canvas bag with its child's drawings of planets, the faint smudge of what appeared to be clay on one shoe, and she made a decision in approximately 3 seconds. She concluded that the man at the registration desk was a driver, a technician, or someone who had wandered in from another event. Wesley extended his invitation. It was printed on heavy cardstock and identified him plainly as Wesley Carrick, principal owner, Carrick Grid and Metals. Dana took it, glanced at it, and handed it back. The name of the company registered somewhere behind her eyes as familiar, but she was not the kind of person who stopped to reconsider a first impression once it had been formed. What she saw instead was an opportunity. The journalists beside her were watching. A man in a worn suit claiming to own a piece of a $2 billion project was the kind of story that made a venue look poorly managed unless the host handled it with visible authority. She decided that Wesley would be useful. She would let him into the room, let her security team track where the invitation had come from, and demonstrate in front of her guests exactly what professional event management looked like. She told him to proceed inside. Wesley offered to call Kara Winslow, who could confirm his identity in under 2 minutes. Dana waved the suggestion off and moved on. She did not look back. Marissa Boyd had been standing close enough to hear the entire exchange. She was Renshaw Infrastructure's vice president of operations and had been with the company for nearly 18 years. Dana had promised her a regional executive appointment and a bonus substantial enough to resolve the financial situation her family had been managing for 2 years, both contingent on the successful closing of Horizon Loop. Marissa had given most of her professional life to this company, and she understood that the closing was days away. But the name on that card had appeared in the operational documents her team had processed during the project's due diligence phase, and something about the way Dana had dismissed it without reading it fully sat uneasily with her. She had suggested they take 60 seconds to verify. Dana had already moved away. Wesley was escorted by a staff member to a table near the far end of the hall, close to the service entrance where the tablecloth was slightly askew and the chair wobbled on the uneven floor. His assigned seat, the one reserved for the principal owner, was at the central table near the banking representatives and project board members. No one corrected the arrangement. The dinner proceeded around him in the particular way that rooms full of powerful people tend to proceed loudly, confidently, and with total indifference to anyone perceived as occupying the wrong tier. A server made 3 passes through the section without setting down a course at his place. A contractor at the adjacent table asked without particular malice how much he was getting paid to drive tonight. Someone further down the row made a comment about leftovers that prompted a small cluster of laughter. Wesley did not respond to any of it. He watched the room with the particular quality of attention that comes from having spent years in negotiations, observing how Dana spoke to the catering staff, how the executives around her calibrated their laughter to match hers, how the people with the most to lose said the least. The woman who eventually acknowledged him directly was sitting 2 seats away, having apparently also found herself misrouted during the seating shuffle. Miriam Decker was a retired engineering professor who now ran an organization called Hands-On Futures Foundation, which provided science education access to children from under-resourced communities. She was in her late 60s, wore her silver hair without apology, and had spent enough years in rooms that did not initially want her in them to recognize exactly what was happening. When she noticed that Wesley's place setting remained empty, while the first course was being cleared from surrounding tables, she slid her own appetizer plate toward the center of the table with a small matter-of-fact gesture and told him there was plenty. Wesley accepted. She asked about the bag. He told her he had come from his daughter's science fair. Miriam did not ask what he did for work, how he had ended up at this particular event, or what his connection to the project was. She said only that showing up for the moments that matter to your child was the kind of achievement that did not fit on a business card. Wesley thought about the drawing in his pocket and did not argue with her. Dana came through the hall during the pre-signing reception hour, moving from table to table with the practiced warmth of someone who understood that managing a room was its own kind of performance. She saw Wesley still seated near the service entrance, talking with visible ease to Miriam, and the sight of him looking comfortable rather than isolated and compliant, which had been the intended effect, produced a flash of something that bypassed professionalism entirely. She crossed the room with intent. She stopped at his table, in full view of the surrounding guests, and told him the evening was concluding and he should find his way out. Wesley told her he had every right to be there and asked her again to read the full text on the invitation she had handled earlier. The response came without heat or urgency. Dana experienced it as a challenge in front of exactly the people she needed to impress, and her composure, which was substantial under most circumstances, began to slip in a way she did not recognize as slipping. She took the invitation card from the table where a staffer had placed it, held it for a moment, and dropped it deliberately. She said something about men who believed a jacket was sufficient credential. Several guests laughed. Most did not. Then she picked up the wine glass from his place setting and poured it in a slow, unhurried movement across his chest. The red spread through the fabric of his shirt and reached the inside breast pocket before he could move. Wesley reached into the pocket and withdrew the folded paper. The wine had soaked through one corner and was spreading across the image, the two figures, the lit city, the careful lettering at the bottom. He held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment that felt longer than it was. The room had gone partially quiet. Dana said that security would have an easier time now identifying which guest needed to be escorted out. The paper in his hands changed the nature of what had just happened. This was no longer a matter of a slight at a professional event. This was a woman who was about to take operational control of a project designed to serve thousands of families, and she had just demonstrated in front of 300 witnesses exactly how she regarded the people she considered beneath her consideration. Wesley looked at Dana and said that she had just decided the fate of this deal. She smiled at the apparent absurdity of the statement, the way someone smiles when they believe they have already won and the other person simply hasn't received the news. He folded the drawing carefully along its original creases and picked up Paige's canvas bag from beside his chair. He thanked Miriam, who was watching him with an expression that gave away nothing but understood everything. Then he walked toward the exit at a pace that was neither hurried nor heavy, past the tables of guests who had watched the entire thing and said nothing through the tall glass doors and out into the night. The moment the doors closed behind him, he took out his phone and called Kara Winslow. He told her to freeze the signing ceremony and activate the partner review clause. Kara asked no questions. She had worked with Wesley long enough to understand that when he used that phrase, the decision had already been made and the reasoning was sound. The call lasted under 90 seconds. Inside Broadstone Pavilion, Dana returned to the stage. The screens behind her displayed the Horizon Loop branding in clean, confident graphics, and the line at the bottom of the main display, the one that had been there since the event began, still read, "Awaiting Principal Owner." The room Wesley had been directed to was 3 floors below the main hall, past the catering prep area and through a corridor that smelled of cleaning solution and cold concrete. It was a small conference space used primarily for vendor logistics, a long folding table, a row of mismatched chairs and fluorescent lighting that left no shadows. Kara Winslow was already there when he arrived, her laptop open and 2 phones on the table in front of her. She had been at Carrick Grid and Metals for 11 years and had learned early that when Wesley called her with a specific instruction rather than a question, the situation had already moved past the stage where questions were useful. She had brought 2 members of the company's legal team with her. The documents she needed were already pulled up on her screen. She had prepared 2 options, which she walked through without editorializing. The first was a modified continuation. Renshaw Infrastructure would remain in the developer role, but with a mandatory public apology from Dana, a restructured management oversight board, and binding performance clauses that would give Carrick Grid direct intervention authority if benchmarks were missed. The second was the cleaner option, and the more consequential one: activate the ethics and governance clause embedded in the project company agreement, which allowed the principal owner to remove and replace the lead developer prior to final contract execution. The formal signing had not yet occurred. Legally, the window was still open. Wesley listened to both without interrupting. Then he asked Kara to bring up the due diligence summary her team had compiled during the partner evaluation phase. The full version, not the executive abstract. She turned the laptop toward him. The report had been assembled over 4 months of standard pre-closing review. What it documented was not a series of isolated incidents, but a pattern: subcontractor payment records manipulated to favor cash flow optics, safety complaints buried through internal reclassification, a site manager let go after formally raising a structural concern, and community benefit expenditures directed overwhelmingly toward branded materials rather than the communities they named. The summary had been flagged with a cautionary note, recommending further review before final execution. Wesley had read it before tonight and had treated it as a risk profile significant, but not yet disqualifying. He read it differently now. Not because the facts had changed, but because he had spent 3 hours watching the person behind those facts operate without any audience she felt accountable to. I was not trying to punish Dana Renshaw. He was trying to answer a specific question: whether he could hand the future of those families to a person who only extended dignity to people she believed could benefit her. He already knew the answer. He asked Kara to get Patrick Rains on the phone. Patrick Rains ran Pioneer Basin Engineering from an office in Fort Collins and had built the company over 2 decades into a mid-size firm with a reputation that was modest in ambition and consistent in delivery. During the original developer selection process, Pioneer Basin had finished second. Dana had outperformed him on the criteria that mattered most to the evaluation committee at the time: banking relationships, media visibility, and the sheer confidence of her presentation. Patrick had submitted a proposal that was quieter and more detailed, focused on labor retention, subcontractor equity terms, and site safety protocols. He had not promised that Horizon Loop would define an era. He had promised it would be built correctly and that no worker on the project would be treated as interchangeable. When Wesley reached him, Patrick was still in his office. He answered on the second ring. Wesley asked him directly whether Pioneer Basin could assume the lead developer position without displacing the existing workforce. Patrick's answer was immediate and unambiguous. His company would only accept under the condition that all qualified current workers were retained, and that every training and apprenticeship commitment already communicated to the labor pool was honored in full. He said this not as a negotiating position, but as a precondition, the way someone states a fact they consider non-negotiable because it genuinely is. Wesley ended the call and signed the resolution. It invoked his authority as 52% principal owner to remove Renshaw Infrastructure Group from the lead developer position and designate Pioneer Basin Engineering as its replacement effective upon formal notice. Kara transmitted the document package to the banking consortium, the project board, and Pioneer Basin's legal team simultaneously. The substitution clause had been drafted into the project company agreement at Wesley's insistence during the initial structuring phase, precisely because he had understood that the formal signing ceremony was not the last point at which a course correction could occur, it was the last point at which one could occur cleanly. They were still inside that window. Wesley looked at the folded drawing one more time, then put it back in his pocket. He told Kara he would be ready to go back upstairs in 30 minutes. Inside the main hall, Dana was doing what she did best under pressure, which was to perform confidence so completely that the absence of a result could be reframed at least temporarily as the result still arriving. She had returned to the stage after Wesley left and delivered a brief aside to the room that characterized the earlier situation as a security matter that had been handled. A few people laughed. Most were watching the display screen behind her, which had not changed. It still read, "Awaiting principal owner," in the clean, unhurried font the design team had chosen because it was supposed to appear only briefly before the signing began. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. The banking representatives at the central table began exchanging looks that required no words. The attorneys who had been positioned near the signing table started checking their phones with the particular frequency that signals they are waiting for information they expected to already have. Leonard Pike, who chaired the lending coalition that had assembled the financing package for the project, eventually stood and made his way toward the edge of the stage. He asked Dana in a voice low enough to be private, but carrying enough for those nearby to hear whether she had met with Wesley Carrick in person prior to this evening. Dana told him that all high-level negotiations had been handled through Kara Winslow and the Carrick legal team. She said this with the tone of someone explaining an industry-standard arrangement, which in one sense it was. But the question Leonard had asked was not about the negotiations. It was about whether she knew who she was waiting for. She assured him that Wesley would appear. She said no one walks away from a $2 billion closing. Marissa had not moved from her position near the side wall since Wesley left. She had watched the door. She had watched Dana recalibrate the room's energy through sheer force of presentation. And she had been turning something over in her mind since the moment she watched the wine hit Wesley's shirt. The specific detail that the name on the invitation card was Carrick, and that she had seen that name before, not at tonight's event, but in the operational documents her team had processed during the project's due diligence phase. She picked up the card from where Dana had dropped it on the table. She searched the company name on her phone. The first result was a trade publication profile from 7 years earlier. A short piece about a Wyoming infrastructure contract that had been notable enough at the time to receive a single page of coverage. There was a photograph. It had been taken at a distance outdoor, slightly overexposed the way event photos are when the photographer is not the main subject. But the face was clear enough. Marissa looked at the photograph and then looked at the door through which the man in the gray suit had walked 40 minutes ago, and the understanding of what had happened settled over her with the particular weight of something that cannot be undone. She brought the phone to Dana without saying anything. She just held it out and waited. Dana, read the caption. She looked at the photograph. Her expression underwent a series of small adjustments that, taken together, communicated the exact shape of the problem she had just recognized. She called Wesley's number. There was no answer. She called again. Still nothing. She told her communications team to begin preparing a statement framing the evening's incident as a misunderstanding arising from a security protocol failure. Marissa told her quietly that they needed to acknowledge what had actually happened. Dana told her that what she needed right now was for everyone on her team to stay aligned, and she reminded Marissa in the careful language of someone who understands exactly what leverage sounds like when it is delivered softly. What was still on the table for her personally if Horizon Loop closed? Marissa said nothing. She put her phone in her pocket. Nearly 40 minutes after Wesley had walked out of the main hall, the tall glass doors at the far end of Broadstone Pavilion opened. He came in wearing a clean shirt. Kara had anticipated this and brought a change of clothes, moving at the same unhurried pace he had used when he left. He was carrying the stained drawing in one hand. Behind him came Kara Winslow, the Carrick Grid legal team, 2 representatives from Pioneer Basin Engineering, and a pair of project board members who had been briefed in the logistics corridor and were now moving with the focused energy of people who understood that the evening had become something entirely different from what it had been advertised as. The room stood up, not all at once and not out of any coordinated impulse, but in the way that rooms respond to the arrival of someone they have just spent 40 minutes realizing they badly misread. The people who had laughed now had somewhere else to look. The people who had said nothing were still saying nothing, but the silence had changed its character entirely. Dana came down from the stage and offered an apology. She used the phrase "a misunderstanding stemming from security concerns," which was the language her communications team had drafted and which had the advantage of being technically non-specific. Wesley let her finish. Then he told her that she had not misunderstood him. She had seen him clearly, seen exactly who she thought he was, and decided that person was not owed basic respect. That was not a misunderstanding. That was a choice. Dana suggested they move to a private room. Wesley declined. The incident had taken place in front of 300 people, and the outcome belonged in the same room. Leonard Pike asked whether the signing would proceed. Wesley confirmed that Horizon Loop would move forward, that the financing was intact, and that the workforce would be protected. Dana's shoulders dropped slightly. She had heard the part she was waiting for. Then Wesley informed the room that Renshaw Infrastructure Group had been removed from the lead developer position. Pioneer Basin Engineering would assume that role under the substitution clause that had been executed prior to tonight's formal signing. Kara presented the signed resolution, along with the preliminary approval from the banking consortium. The document had a timestamp. It had been generated and transmitted before Wesley had set foot back inside the building. Dana said that he was punishing her over a glass of wine. Wesley set the drawing down on the table beside him, the image of 2 figures, a lit city, a child's handwriting along the bottom, and told her that the wine had nothing to do with it. The wine had only shown everyone in the room who she was when she believed the person in front of her had no power over her. That was the reason. That had always been the only reason. The banking representatives began making calls. Several of Renshaw's institutional backers collected their materials and moved toward the exit. The journalists in the room, who had come expecting to file a story about a landmark signing, were already rewriting their leadies. Dana Renshaw stood at the front of the stage she had designed to celebrate herself, and there was nothing left to say that would not make it worse. Dana Renshaw had not built her career by accepting outcomes she had not chosen. She had spent 20 years turning unfavorable situations into negotiating positions. And she understood in the minutes after Wesley's announcement landed in the room that she still had one tool available to her that no signed resolution could immediately neutralize. She announced in the measured tone of someone issuing a statement, rather than making a threat, that Renshaw Infrastructure Group would be filing for an emergency injunction to freeze the Horizon Loop project pending a full review of the substitution process. Her position was that Wesley had exploited a personal incident to trigger a contractual mechanism outside of its intended purpose, and that if a court agreed to even a temporary hold, the project timeline would collapse far enough to force a renegotiation of the banking terms, which would bring everyone back to the table, including her. The room understood what she was doing. So did Leonard Pike, who asked Wesley directly whether the substitution had been executed on grounds that could withstand independent legal scrutiny, meaning grounds that existed before the events of the evening, documented and time-stamped in a way that could not be characterized as retaliatory. Wesley told him to ask Kara. Kara opened the due diligence summary on her laptop and walked Leonard through the flagged findings: the pattern of subcontractor payment manipulation, the buried safety complaints, the terminated site manager, the community program expenditures that existed largely on paper. All of it had been compiled during the standard pre-closing review process. All of it carried dates that preceded tonight's event by months. Leonard read through the summary with the focus of someone who had spent his career learning to distinguish between documentation assembled for a purpose and documentation that revealed a purpose already present. The legal threat had weight only if the substitution could be painted as personal and retaliatory. The paper trail made that argument difficult to sustain. But the most consequential internal records, the ones that showed Dana had specifically directed the suppression of the safety report and had personally instructed the finance department to delay subcontractor payments in order to improve the company's cash flow presentation before the closing, those required corroboration from someone inside Renshaw Infrastructure. Without a witness, they remained plausible inferences rather than confirmed facts. Dana understood this as well as anyone in the room, and she turned to look at Marissa Boyd with the particular steadiness of someone reminding another person of what they stand to lose. Marissa had been standing near the side wall for the past hour in approximately the same position she had occupied since Wesley left the first time. She had watched the announcement. She had watched Dana regroup. She had watched the banking representatives review Kara's documentation and begin to reach the same conclusions she had already reached on her own. She had also spent 18 years watching a company she had believed in operate in ways she had told herself were manageable or standard, or at least not her responsibility to expose. The bonus Dana had promised her was real. The promotion was real. The debt her family was carrying was real. She was aware of all of it, and none of it had stopped feeling true in the past hour. But something else had also become true, and she could not find a way to make it smaller than it was. She walked to the front of the room. She did not take the stage that would have been a performance, and what she had to say was not a performance. She stood at floor level near the signing table that had not yet been used, and she spoke in the even voice of someone who has decided that precision matters more than composure. She confirmed that Dana had instructed the legal team to reclassify the safety complaint filed by the operations manager so that it would not trigger mandatory escalation under the project's regulatory requirements. She confirmed that Dana had directed the finance department to restructure the subcontractor payment schedule in the final quarter before closing in order to present a stronger liquidity position to the banking consortium. Neither of these things had appeared in any external audit because both had been handled through internal process adjustments that looked on paper like routine operational decisions. Then Marissa said something that was not in any document. She said that what had happened to Wesley that evening was not an isolated lapse. She said that the way Dana had treated him, the certainty that someone in a worn suit carrying a child's canvas bag could be publicly humiliated without consequence, was not a deviation from the culture of Renshaw infrastructure. It was a demonstration of it. She said that tonight was simply the first time the person on the receiving end had possessed enough standing to make the room pay attention to what had always been there. When she finished, the room was quiet in a way that was different from the quiet that follows a surprising announcement. It was the quiet that follows a truth that everyone present had sensed but had not yet had the language for. Dana's injunction threat dissolved in real time. Without the argument that the substitution was personal and retaliatory, and with Marissa's corroboration now on record in front of the banking consortium, the project board, and a room full of journalists, the legal position had no viable foundation. The board convened an emergency call before the evening was over. Dana was suspended from her executive duties pending an internal investigation. The company's legal team, acting on counsel from outside advisors, formally withdrew the injunction filing and issued a statement indicating that Renshaw Infrastructure would be cooperating with any independent review process. Wesley did not watch any of that unfold with particular satisfaction. He was standing near the back of the room, closer to the exit than to the stage, and he was thinking about the fact that a company had arrived at this moment not because of a single bad decision by one executive, but because a culture of looking away had accumulated into something that eventually had nowhere left to hide. He had not needed to dismantle Renshaw Infrastructure. The structure Dana had built, where disagreement was managed through loyalty, incentives, and silence was rewarded with advancement, had simply run out of people willing to hold it up. After the formal proceedings concluded and the room began to empty, Miriam Decker made her way across the hall toward Wesley. She told him she was sorry she had not done more earlier. She said she had noticed what was happening and had responded in the small way available to her, but had not done the harder thing, which was to stand up directly in the moment it was most needed. Wesley told her that she had done the one thing that no one else in the room had done before his name meant anything to them. She had shared her food. She had asked about his daughter. She had treated the evening as a conversation rather than a transaction. He told her that in a room full of people who had performed generosity for an audience, she had been the only person who had not needed one. He then told her that Carrick Grid and Metals would be making a contribution of $5 million to Hands-On Futures Foundation, designated for the construction of science learning labs, technical scholarship support, and a childcare program specifically structured for single parents pursuing vocational training. Miriam looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating the scale of the evening. She said she had only shared a plate of food. Wesley told her that was precisely the point. She had shared it when she believed he had nothing to offer in return. That was the only version of generosity that meant anything. He also spoke with Marissa before she left the building. The conversation was short and did not include an offer of employment. Wesley told her that speaking up after years of silence was not the same thing as having spoken up, and that she would have to sit with that distinction for a while. But he also told her that it was the beginning of something if she chose to treat it that way. Marissa told him she intended to provide full documentation to the independent review and would be resigning from Renshaw Infrastructure, effective immediately. Wesley nodded. He did not tell her what he thought about the choice. It was hers to make, and she had made it, and that was enough for now. Patrick Rains and his team were already in contact with the project board by the time the hall had cleared. The transition framework was not simple, but it was manageable. Pioneer Basin had been second in the original selection process and had kept a working version of their project plan updated in the intervening months, which was the kind of operational discipline that said something about how the company approached work it had not yet won. Patrick's first formal commitment delivered in writing to the project board before midnight was that every worker currently contracted to the Horizon Loop project who met the technical qualifications for their role would receive a retention offer. The second commitment was that all subcontractor payments that had been delayed under the previous arrangement would be released within 30 days. The third was the establishment of a worker safety advisory panel with direct reporting authority to the project board, not a symbolic structure, but a functional one with real escalation power. Wesley added one condition of his own. He required that the plans for the main Horizon Loop facility complex include a dedicated childcare center fully operational by the time construction crews reached peak staffing levels. A childcare center was not a benefit or a perk. It was an acknowledgement that the people building the infrastructure had lives outside the worksite, and that those lives mattered to the outcome. 18 months later, the first phase of Horizon Loop came online on schedule. Nearly 1,800 workers had remained on the project from the transition through completion. The apprenticeship and vocational training programs were fully operational under Pioneer Basin, with enrollment substantially higher than the initial targets. Many of the participants were single parents. The ceremony, marking the activation of the first power distribution station, was held on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, when the light in Colorado comes in at an angle that makes everything look like it was built to last. Wesley was not at the center of the stage. He was standing in the second row of the guest section, slightly to the left, with Paige beside him. She was 10 now and had opinions about the station's transformer configuration that she had already shared with two of the Pioneer Basin engineers, who had listened with the specific attention of people who recognized that the question was better than they expected. The drawing that had been in Wesley's breast pocket on the night of the Broadstone dinner wine stained at one corner. The image of two figures standing before a city full of light had been framed under glass and hung at the entrance of the childcare center on the facility grounds. Below the drawing on a small plaque was the line Paige had written in her careful, uneven print, "Build somewhere every family is safe." When the activation sequence was ready, one of the project engineers invited Paige to the control panel. She looked at her father once, checking not for permission, but for confirmation that this was real. Wesley nodded. She pressed the switch. The display boards across the complex lit up in sequence, and the low hum of the first distribution loop coming online moved through the building, the way a held breath finally releases. Paige turned back to Wesley and asked whether this was the biggest deal he had ever done. He thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. Then he told her it was not. He told her the biggest thing was that they had not let one person's cruelty become the reason thousands of good people lost their future. Paige considered this and said it sounded like something that should be on a plaque. Wesley said that as far as he was concerned, it already was. Dana Renshaw's name did not appear on any of the materials produced for the ceremony. The investigation into Renshaw Infrastructure's internal practices resulted in significant findings that the board addressed through a combination of executive restructuring and regulatory settlements. The company continued to exist in a reduced form, managed by a new leadership team working to establish that they were something different from what had come before. What this story keeps coming back to is something simple: the way we treat people when we believe they can't do anything for us is the truest measure of who we are. Dana had every credential, every platform, every opportunity that evening to lead something worth being proud of. She chose instead to humiliate a man in a worn suit because she was certain he didn't matter. That certainty cost her everything. Wesley, who had every reason to respond in kind, used his power to protect the people who had no power at all. That choice built something that is still standing. If that's the kind of story that stays with you, if you believe that how we treat people matters, not just when it's convenient, then this channel is worth keeping around. Subscribe if you haven't already, and share this one with someone who needs to hear it today. These stories don't change the world on their own, but sometimes they remind us of the kind of people we're still capable of being.